Hello again, everybody. I hope all is going well. So, I've been noticing a pattern for some time now of what I will call a reliance on force as opposed to a reliance on policy in the government that seems to be picking up a lot of speed lately. This progression also seems to be boosting the abilities of the federal government specifically more and more. And more, I am seeing people talk about the concern of this increase in federal authority, which some are saying will lead to tyranny. I think it started with the ICE deportations, in which we saw the deployment of the Marine Corps and National Guard troops, then more recently, the crackdown on crime and homelessness, where the National Guard was used again in Washington, D.C., with a desire to move that same plan to cities like New York City, Baltimore, Oakland, and Chicago. But now, we are also seeing the creation of a couple new things. One which is being dubbed the Military Reaction Force, and the other which is called the Comprehensive Crime Bill. And I can't help but feel as though we may be entering a bit of a slippery slope here. So I'd like to point some things out and talk about the kind of path that we are on, which is a path toward the reliance on federal government and its use of force. In this video, I will give some context about the short lead up to the present moment. I will explain what the Military Reaction Force is and what the Comprehensive Crime Bill will do. I will also talk about the potential trajectory of setting these kinds of precedents, and I will talk about alternative solutions to using federal force. Let's begin with some context. It was on January 23rd that ICE began expanding its efforts for deportation into sanctuary cities. And I don't remember hearing a whole lot about it at first, as I guess things were mostly going according to plan. But in June, we saw the riots erupt as ICE moved into Los Angeles. We saw federal officers masking up in order to anonymize themselves, citing threats to them and their families as the reason. And after just a few days on July 7th, Trump decided to deploy around 700-something Marines and over 4,000 National Guard troops. And if you remember, there was a whole ton of criticism for using the military to quell civil unrest. But by July 21st, 2 weeks later, all of the Marines and about half of the National Guardsmen were withdrawn from the city. Now we move to August 11th, when Trump invokes Section 740 of the Home Rule Act, which granted the federal government control of Washington, D.C.'s Metropolitan Police Department and authorized the use of approximately 800 National Guardsmen initially in an attempt to combat what Trump called a crime emergency. There is now upwards of 2,000 of these National Guardsmen in D.C., many of whom are armed with M4 combat rifles. So far, it appears as though violent crime in D.C. is down 45% from this same period last year, which is a small sample size, but I guess we will see how it plays out long term. My guess is that this will continue to suppress crime so long as the National Guard remains, and so, on the back of what is being reported as a success in D.C., Trump is now looking to expand the effort we've seen in D.C. to other cities, as well as establish a group of National Guardsmen called the Military Reaction Force, and is also proposing to write something called the Comprehensive Crime Bill. So let's get into what those are. The Military Reaction Force will essentially be a special 600-member group composed of National Guardsmen who come from a large number of participating states. Currently, these are the states whose participation has been proposed. The force will be split into two 300-member wings. One will be used east of the Mississippi River, which will have a hub of some sort in Alabama, and the other will be used west of the Mississippi River, with a hub in Arizona. Apparently, each state's National Guard will have a select group of guardsmen that will be specifically trained for the tasks that the force will be deployed for. These tasks will include things like quelling civil disturbances, presumably like the ones we saw in LA, reinforcing federal and local law enforcement, which seems like a very broad role to play, and protecting federal property as well. And well, I guess I have a few questions about why this is a necessity, because to me, this kind of seems like an admission that the police departments around the country are struggling to maintain order when issues arise. Whether it's understaffing or budgetary issues or bad department policy, for one reason or another, we're being told that we need something like this to maintain law and order. Something that is essentially a hybrid of or a middle point of law enforcement and the military. To me, that's the same as saying that just having police departments doesn't work anymore. My next question would be, how big is this thing going to be 5, 10, or 15 years from now? Will it be normal to have ineffectual police departments who rely on the federal government to confront riots or other forms of civil unrest? And I also want to ask, are we working on restoring the police to a position of competence, or is this just a push to make us more reliant on federal intervention? Because I don't hear any admission of the premise for this military reaction force, which is that our local governments are failing to do this job themselves. The intent may be to just use this in specific cities that fall behind, but my guess is that we will see more and more federal intervention like this going forward. And I can't help but wonder if that isn't the point. Anyways, on to the proposed bill. The Comprehensive Crime Bill is currently being written and isn't even on its way for a congressional vote yet. But according to Trump, it will seek to create harsher penalties for crimes committed in Washington, D.C. One way in which it will make penalties harsher will be to lower the age limit for adult prosecution in D.C. to 14, for example. In D.C. specifically, it will also seek to add more federal agents, which will include prosecutors and police officers and law enforcement recruiters as well. At the national scale, Trump wants this bill to do things like ending cashless bail, setting federal standards for pretrial release of people with criminal charges, and increase the punishment for a number of crimes, including violent crimes, theft, and property damage. So basically, the bill will attempt to decrease crime by increasing law enforcement in D.C. and creating a less forgiving judicial system. But once again, the bill is proposed to do much of this by setting federal-level policy that the states will have to abide by. And that is really the reason I am making this video, to simply point out that the precedent which is being set right now could potentially be dangerous. Now let's talk about the potential trajectories of the federal force mindset. Let's think about why this could be dangerous. Ideally, the measures currently being taken are temporary. Ideally, they are viewed by Trump and the federal government at large as a necessary evil. In this case, we will end up seeing these measures repealed as local law enforcement returns to a state of competence all throughout the country at some point in the future. I think this is what many people involved are assuming will happen without really thinking about it. But it's really important to remember that history shows us that the reliance on force ends up becoming a crutch, which can quickly devolve into tyranny. As the injustices against the people inevitably pile up, you end up needing to use increasingly brutal measures to maintain your control, which is a control rooted in fear. I think a really good historical parallel to what we are living through in the present would be something like what General Augusto Pinochet did in Chile in the 70s and 80s. It was similar because General Pinochet was the commander-in-chief of Chile's armed forces, just as Trump is the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces. This is what General Pinochet was before he launched his coup in 1973. Afterwards, he was basically a tyrannical monarch, or rather a dictator. This time period leading up to Pinochet's rule was also marked by a similar social and economic situation. The country was incredibly polarized at the time, like ours is now, and the lower and middle classes were suffering from wage stagnation, unemployment, and increasing prices, which is also quite similar to what we are seeing now. General Pinochet initiated his coup by surrounding many of the major cities in Chile, especially the ones where he felt there would be the most resistance, which is similar to the current plan to send the National Guard and other federal law enforcement agencies into other cities like Baltimore, Chicago, and New York, which is currently what Trump plans to do. General Pinochet went on to rule for 17 years, and what really caught my eye is that once the coup had established him to the status of a dictator, it really didn't take many resources for him to silence dissent. He basically just had a group of guys that would travel around in Puma helicopters, flying directly to where dissenters were, who would execute the dissenters and bury them or fly them out to the ocean and throw them out of the helicopter. But yeah, it didn't take much to keep people quiet after the initial coup, which resulted in the death of nearly 10,000 civilians. So, when it comes to the present day in the US, I think we really need to start demanding more intelligent solutions. We really don't want to start down the road of allowing our leaders to use a sledgehammer as the solution for every problem. Because it's easy to set the precedent, all you have to do is to allow something to occur without enough pushback, and then it's normalized. And at that point, it will be much harder to repeal the culture that is created by what will be normalized and return to where we were. Let's review some of the other options we have when it comes to dealing with illegal immigration, crime, and homelessness. Many of the solutions I will talk about are fairly well known, although they do rarely seem to be articulated in public discourse. And that's likely a large part of the problem, which is that things like homeless camp sweeps, riot control, mass incarceration, and overdose deaths seem to be far more engaging than their systemic solutions. I think that in this way we naturally gravitate toward the use of force simply because it's, well, simple to understand, but also sensational. We evolved to be more interested in physical conflict than systems producing quantifiable results, right? It just sounds boring. But let's start with some solutions for illegal immigration, for instance, which is the problem cited for things like massive ICE and border control budget increases, as well as Marine Corps and National Guard intervention. One thing I rarely seem to hear about is the process of naturalization, which is when an individual not born in the United States voluntarily becomes a United States citizen. This is a notoriously lengthy and tricky process that many people who come here never end up completing, usually because they aren't here lawfully, which is a requirement. But let's take a closer look at this process. There are three major steps to this thing. The first step is to obtain what is called a lawful permanent resident status. This requires the individual to obtain a visa or, in many cases, a green card. Visas are temporary, green cards are permanent. However, this requires a connection already within the United States, as most of these are given out to people with family who are already here or an employment opportunity here. They are also given out for some humanitarian reasons, like being a refugee. So, without some established connection here or your life being at stake in another country torn by violence, it's pretty difficult to get in. The second step requires an individual to live here consecutively for 5 years and abide by fairly strict guidelines. These include things such as filing tax returns every single year, paying off or establishing payment plans for all debts, not engaging in habitual drunkenness or recreational drug use, renewing all permits such as re-entry permits, visas, or green cards in a timely manner, reporting address changes within 10 days, and actually registering for selective service. Things that we are all basically supposed to do anyways, but that they have to be perfect on for 5 years. Once those two steps are completed, the individual can apply for naturalization and must provide proficiency in things like ethical decision-making, reading and writing in the English language, and an understanding of the U.S. Constitution. We can see how involved this process is, with the hardest step, in my opinion, being the first one. Just getting in the door can be quite challenging. So we are hard at work removing everyone that has come in illegally over the years, many of which who have come in the last 5 years, and it is costing the US taxpayer a ton of money. I can't help but think maybe we could take a policy approach and cut down the requirements for naturalization, as well as use more of that money to vet these people and then educate the ones who are good, so that they can function here and provide value to our country. I hear a lot of people saying things like they aren't just deporting criminals, and well, that's currently the plan. The plan is to deport everyone who is here illegally. But why not just seal up the border like we have already done, and then create intelligent policy to resolve the illegal status and turn them into more taxpayers? I think that is what we would be seeing right now from more intelligent leadership. Because sure, there are criminals and they need to get the fuck out. But there is a much greater number of hardworking and moral individuals who we do want to keep. Why not put some of that ICE and Border Patrol money into having an initial screening process to make sure these people don't already have criminal records? Let them in, use more of that money to teach them English and the Constitution, and then make them a citizen after maybe 1 or 2 years, with increased leniency for some of the listed requirements. You could even have a probation period for things like crime, where you could revoke citizenship for felony crimes at any time in the future. But no, you know what I think? I think a lot of corporations and businesses here enjoy cheap, second-class illegal citizen labor, where they don't have to pay these individuals nearly as much as a legal U.S. citizen. I also think that anyone who operates at the level of the federal government wants to increase the power and authority of the federal government, which, aside from being sensational, is why they talk about using force instead of intelligent policy. When it comes to the issues of both crime and homelessness, we could heavily reduce the numbers by simply restoring our economy, which is another thing that no one in the federal government will even admit is an issue. They point at the indexes in the stock market, they point at the GDP, they point at all these different metrics and say the economy is doing well. But the reality is that a lot of people are not doing well financially right now, which of course leads to things like anger, fear, and desperation. So here are a number of things I haven't seen the federal government even mention. The first one is job programs. Instead of increasing the annual budget for the military and federal law enforcement in general by another $200 billion, let's put that money toward youth job programs, which have been shown to significantly reduce crime rates, especially among young men. Let's put that money toward vocational training to help people enter sectors like tech, the trades, and transportation. Apparently, this strategy works really well at reducing recidivism rates. But then I guess privately owned prisons won't make as much money, so maybe we shouldn't do that. Let's put that money toward grants for small businesses who are looking to actively and continuously generate value for their communities. If you've tried starting a business in the last 5 years, you've likely discovered that it is very expensive and filled with confusing bureaucracy. It's damn near impossible. And here's another one. Why don't we start talking about how unaffordable housing is? We allow corporations, large and small, to buy up tons of housing and run it out for the rest of eternity with no intent to sell it. This decreases the supply of houses actually for sale, which jacks up the price. When you couple that with a government who overspends and then prints trillions of dollars to cover their own ass, your money is worth less and less, which means the dollar value of housing skyrockets, along with everything else. How about we raise the minimum wage to a level where people can comfortably live in modest locations? The minimum wage is currently $7.25 per hour federally, but in most towns and cities in the US, it takes a wage of at least $20 per hour on average to live comfortably. And $20 an hour is still much higher than almost all of the minimum wages set by state laws. Mental health also plays a massive role here, as we see an increasing amount of dysfunctional behavior within our populace. Let's get to the root of that and stop masking it with prescription drugs that usually just end up making it worse. So, this path we're on is not a good one. It seems like we're just reacting to the symptoms of illegal immigration, crime, and homelessness with increasing force and seemingly no conversation about the root causes. People cannot be here illegally, but it's going to be insanely expensive to deport them at this point. Are we truly incapable of vetting them properly and keeping the good ones? Are we truly incapable of realizing our economic situation is fucking horrible right now and that money would be better spent on getting people employed or helping them start businesses? Or maybe the government could even set up projects to address our decaying infrastructure? I mean, this kind of thing seemed to work pretty well for Roosevelt and the alphabet agencies he established, which ended up employing millions of people and built an immense amount of infrastructure which we still use to this day. And in this thought about increasing federal power and federal jurisdiction when it comes to the use of law enforcement, the military, and whatever hybrid shit exists in between, I seriously start to wonder if our leaders believe in us or if they're afraid of us. Because if they believed in us, I would expect to see at least some dialogue in regards to the solutions I have mentioned. But instead, what we are seeing in totality is a whole bunch of attention being given to daily occurrences like floods, mass shootings, and social media drama, a whole bunch of attention being given to what the federal government will do to force correct what are framed as the misdeeds of the opposing political party, and a whole bunch of attention given to the affairs of other countries, such as Israel and Ukraine. Meanwhile, no attention is being given to the US population as we suffer from numerous rectifiable afflictions. Our immigration system sucks, housing is unaffordable, healthcare is unaffordable, and taxes keep creeping upwards. And I wonder if maybe that is what they are afraid of. I wonder if they've screwed the pooch too hard for too long and know that it will take a major reset to set things right again. A major reset in which all debts are absolved and they lose their ass. So I think we should demand better, more intelligent solutions. We should demand that if necessary, these measures being taken now are short-lived and that they do not expand any further. I, for one, believe in our population to do what is right when our needs are met, and that's because we have a long history of it actually working that way. Anyways, that's all I have for now. I'll see you in the next one.